recently also Marco Fongoni joined as a theoretical economist. This paper is about the quite prominent and already mentioned rent freeze in Berlin that had been active for a very short term last year, and we are analyzing the effects of this policy. Okay. Right. I guess everyone knows, but I still want to just mention what we are distinguishing here mainly in terms of first and second generation rent control. So the main differentiation is that the first generation limits the initial rent amount in new contracts. For instance, euros per square meter, euros per room, or whatever. And today, more common would be the second generation rent control, which caps the increase of existing rents. So at the very beginning, you have a kind of or almost free market where rents
I'm sorry, Sophie. Sorry, Sophie, for the interruption. We can't see your slides.
Okay, I'm sharing. It tells me.
Yeah,
we see that you're sharing, but we see a black screen.
Okay, that's interesting. How could I?
You can, yeah. You could send your slides to me.
Or maybe I stop and reshare.
Or try to reshare, yeah.
Yeah, try that.
Interesting, because it was working before, no?
In the very beginning, yes, but not after the break.
Maybe the break was not good.
No, somebody didn't relax enough.
Computer didn't. Do you see it now?
Not yet.
No, it's the same.
Okay. I think I'm doing exactly the same, to be honest.
If you can send the file to me or to Konstantin, I'll write my mail in the chat.
Actually, I can download it and launch.
Yeah, you can directly download it. Thank you very much.
Okay, great.
Here's access to the overlay. Anyhow.
Okay, but go on. I will, as soon as it's ready, I will share the presentation.
Yeah, but I think if you cannot see what I'm.
Okay, yeah. Just a second. It will be.
No, the only thing first, I mean, you all know we are distinguishing first and second generation, and the main feature we're actually looking here at the main difference that is important here is that the initial price is in the second generation usually bargained on kind of free market mechanisms, and only the first generation rent control, also the initial price is kept from the very beginning onwards. And a very new policy in Berlin, the so-called Mietendeckel in German, or rent freeze in English, that went actually back to a first generation rent control policy, and that in 2020, so last year. And it's also quite interesting because there has been a lot of rent regulation already before in Berlin or in Germany in general, including Berlin. And so there was just on top of all that, only for the federal state of Berlin, an additional rent control policy was introduced. And I think now I would actually need my slides again to show you also what I really mean. Otherwise, it's a bit hard to follow.
Can you see the slides?
Yes, now I can see the slides.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, sorry for, I don't know what happened here. Okay, yes, so what I mentioned before, it is added to a substantial body of existing regulations, and most importantly, the so-called rent break or Mietpreisbremse, that is already a quite strict rent control policy, but it's a clearly second generation rent control policy. And the so-called rent break is a policy that is covering entire Germany, whereas the rent freeze is really only affecting the Berlin market and no other German housing market. It was, when it was enacted, it was intended to be active for at least 5 years. However, it was much earlier abolished by the federal courts in Germany. So it was already abolished on the 25th of March 2021, so this year. So it was actually effective in a very, very short period. Right, so what are the main policy features? Just to give you an overview. First of all, and that is the most important one, is that it really only covered the Berlin market. And by Berlin, they really mean the city, the official administrative city boundaries. Berlin is a modern European large city, so you can imagine that the entire metropolitan area is much larger than the city boundaries. So there's really now a cut kind of in the middle of the city, so to say. As I mentioned before, initially it was planned to be valid for 5 years upon enactment. That's what the original plan. But eventually it was valid only until the 25th of March 2021, so a bit earlier this year. Per default, this is also interesting. In general, all premises for rent are covered. So it's not that there's a list like who is covered and everything that is not mentioned would be not covered, but it's rather the other way around. So it's stated that every unit is covered, and then the exceptions are stated separately. The main exceptions are very new rent premises, but I will also give you a list of to show you exactly what has been excluded. Yes. And additionally to that, maybe go back again, Konstantin. There's also, no, back, thanks. There was also a valid rent. The valid rent we've heard already today is a calculation using the so-called Berlin Mietspiegel, where you can look up for your address of your premises to actually find out how much rent is allowed to be charged exactly for this area. And it's really defined on a very local basis, namely on address level. So this is also important. So now next slide, please. Right. So how to really compute this valid rent? Also not so easy. Depends on several features. One is the year of construction, so when the entire house was built, and whether it has basic equipment, heating and bathrooms. This is important for the very old premises, which is on the next slide. Right. So in very old buildings that were constructed before 1918, you distinguish between 3 different types of premises. So do you have central heating and a bathroom? Or do you only have a central heating or a bathroom? Or do you have neither central heating nor bathrooms? And yes, there are still a couple of them existent. And depending on these things, there would then be a so-called valid rent stated. And you can actually then look it up in this table. For the newer ones, so those built between 2003 and 2013, all of them have already central heating and bathrooms. So that would be the highest rent that was allowed, which amounts to €9.80 per square meter. And the lowest one would be the very old one without any equipment. That amounts to €3.92 per square meter. Next slide. Right. So these are the first things how to find out how much rent you're allowed to ask. And then there's several add-ons allowed. So you can have add-ons for modern equipment. Modern equipment is also a long list of what actually counts as modern equipment. For instance, an elevator, and a couple of other predetermined adjustments for location. And also these locations are then determined on an address level using this Mietspiegel, which I mentioned already before. And then adjustment in accordance with the CPI were planned to happen after 2022. However, that didn't happen anymore because the rent freeze was abolished earlier. Okay. What else are the exceptions and which one are we using for our analysis here? So there are mainly 4 exceptions. First were housing units that has been that became ready for occupation for the very first time on January 1st, 2014 or later. Apartments that have been substantially modernized, so that is kind of comparable to new construction. So in that sense, it's new to the housing sector. Also, publicly subsidized apartments would also be excluded. However, that's a very different market, so we actually do not look on those. And then the other exception we're also looking at are housing units that are just across the administrative boundaries or the administrative border of the Berlin city. Right. So what is our research design? We do a couple of components. So we actually first start with a quite descriptive analysis or descriptive comparisons between sales and between sales data and rent data, and also look at other locations, so other big cities in Germany and also neighboring cities in Berlin. Then we estimate an overall price effect using hedonic style different diffs over time. So we distinguished 3 different periods. So a pre-announcement date, so before the rent freeze was first announced. Then the transition period, so the period where it was already clear that the rent freeze would come, and then the post-enactment period. We all looked here only on the within Berlin market. And then we also measure spatial discontinuity at the administrative borders with Brandenburg. And then what you also look at are the volume effects, because there's a lot happening. Because we actually find that the number of advertisements goes down sharply with enactment of this policy. And for this one to explain why this is actually happening, we therefore need a bit of a theory, and that's what we are currently working on. Thank you. So in terms of data, we rely exclusively on rent advertisements. And rent advertisements for these reasons, because you can really date them to the exact dates of the enactment and the first introduction of the rent freeze policy. So we can really measure that exactly, given the very long process of buying a house or buying an apartment and establishing rent contracts too. All in all, we looked then at the period from beginning of 2018 and June 2020. And we stopped it with June 2020 for this analysis to exclude all COVID-related effects, because on this in June, the first big restriction in Berlin and the first big lockdown actually happened in Berlin, so that we can actually really exclude this effect. We use data from a commercial provider that pools pretty much all online advertising portals in Germany. They were formerly called Empirica, but were just renamed to Value Marktdaten. And the good thing is that they are not just one portal, but they really pool pretty much all existing portals in Germany. And they give us the exact price or rent in that sense, but also then all information that is provided in these rent advertisements, including precise location in form of longitudes and latitudes. Yes, and we also have all the characteristics we wish for. Okay, first we just construct a very descriptive analysis. We just compare sales and rent prices. So what's going on? So the solid line are sales prices, and the dashed line are is a rent index. And here we actually distinguish between the announcement and the enactment date. And what you already see that upon enactment, the rents are sharply falling at first, going up a bit again, but in general, there's a stark reduction of asking rents in relationship with this policy. But we do the measurement of this effect in more precise way later on. Next slide, please. Right. So, and for that, I actually present you now our identification strategy. So we have in general 2 strategies we look at. First, like one large diff and diff model, and then we also look at 2 small, so-called small diff and diffs. So the strategy A distinguishes between a pre-announcement period as a baseline, then looks at the transition period, where it was already clear that the rent freeze would come, but it was not in place yet. And then we use the enactment date to then transit into the 3rd period, which is then the post-enactment period. And then we also estimate so-called small diffs and diffs, where we look direct, only on this effects announcement and enactment with a balanced time span before and after. The reason is also, as I mentioned before, that we really stop here to get rid of all COVID effects. Thank you. Right, and just to distinguish treatment and not treated, we use all these exceptions that were stated explicitly in the law as a control group. In terms of model equation, I think it's pretty standard diff and diffs. So we always regress the log monthly rent price that was stated in the advertisements on tons of characteristics, housing characteristics, and then dummies for transition and for the transition periods, the enactment periods, and the announcement period, depending on which strategy you're actually following. Next one, please. Yes, and so this is the first interesting graph here. So the strategy here, like column A, is, that's the first strategy, and then column strategy B has obviously 2 columns because you look at 2 separate models here. First, what we find, which is pretty obvious, that our treatment group has lower asking rents, obviously because all the new apartments are in the control group, and those are just more expensive, which makes a lot of sense. And then we measure a very stark treatment effect here for the post-enactment period. So the pure announcement didn't really do a lot to the market, at least we cannot measure it. However, then upon enactment, the asking rents decreased heavily up to 11%, depends on how you measure it exactly. But this is really a huge reduction as compared to other apartments. And we control here for all these housing characteristics I've mentioned before.
I'm sorry, Sophie, 2 minutes are left.
Slide, please. Okay. Yes. Also, I mentioned already we are measuring also spatial regression discontinuity. Maybe you can directly go to the next slide. Right. So here's actually how we do that. So we have Berlin, that is the red dot in the middle, and then we have Brandenburg just around Berlin, and then we go closer to the city border to really measure exactly at the city border, pretty much neighboring flats. That are just separated by the boundaries of this administrative thing. And then we see in the next slide the result. Right, so here graphically, first what is not surprising, the closer, the more we go away from the city center, the cheaper the rents get, which is not surprising. But then again, exactly at the city border, we have a huge gap now. And this huge gap we can actually show has not been there before, but was only introduced to the rent freeze. So outside of the Berlin city border, we have now this much higher asking rents as just their neighbors within the city border. Next slide, please. Here we also have the numerical examples here. Also, what is maybe important here that we have next to this, just are you outside or inside that, we also include compass directions. So we have also this full locational effect included here. And again, all the effects we measure here are super significant and super strong and really show that this is a huge disparity introduced. Next slide, please. This is the most important slide, and this is also what we're currently working on to explain this volume effect. Here we look again at the transition period, the transition period, and the post period. On the left-hand side, you have rent advertisements, so the number of rent advertisements posted per week. On the left side for rent, on the right side for sales data. And what we find here is that upon enactment, there were just hardly any postings anymore. And also the difference is statistically significant. In this comparison, we didn't see anything like that for the sales data. So this we only see for the rent data. And we actually argue that this is probably because of a lot of juridical insecurity, because from the very beginning on, it was clear that this law is not on very stable grounds, because it was challenged in front of the Constitutional Court immediately. And it was actually then this challenge was very successful because it was then abolished due to legal problems. And what we actually find in these advertisements is that after a couple of weeks or weeks actually, a kind of hedging strategy emerged. So at some point, there was not just one rent price posted in the advertisements, but there were two. One was the one following the rent freeze law, and the other alternative rent was a rent that would be charged if the rent freeze would fall, which then also happened. So that means actually there was kind of a risk transfer from the owners or landlords that were posting ads. They were transferring the risk that this law would not hold to the future tenants. And once this strategy was actually established, the number of advertisements was going up again. And this is exactly this effect which we are seeing here, which also means that legal insecurity in such a market, which is so sensitive to things like that, is a well, really problematic things, which you see immediately in all this revealed behavior of all the agents involved in this market. Thanks a lot. I think if you still have time, I could also show you, yeah, this is exactly the model we are then looking at, but I believe I'm already far over time, so I just stop here. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Sofie. I'm sorry we have too strict schedule. Probably next time we will relax it to leave more space for questions, because I think the questions is the second most important thing after the presentation. Andrei, but if you have a question, but please be short, because it will be at the expense of your own presentation.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Sofie. My question is about the share of the offers you analyzed in your data set, the offers on online platforms in relation to all moves you had in the same time in Berlin. So, and I have some data so that also before Corona came in place, and also before the rent regulation or the rent control setting in Berlin, that only 44% of all housings are announced on these offers, and therefore I ask how evident is the analysis when you only analyze the part of the market and not the whole market?
The question is whether it's really a part. I mean, online advertisements is pretty much the norm, and this platform is not just one portal, but actually pools all the portals that are existent. But I think Konstantin can say more about that. Do you know any other practices of how Germans are finding their apartments in 2020?
No, I think nowadays that's the most important source of information. So previously it was newspapers, maybe word in the mouth, but I think that new internet and advertisements became by far the most important source of information about.
I mean, one thing I can think of are actually Facebook groups, quite prominent among students. That's something we cannot capture.
Yeah, I'm sure that is the most important source of such kind of information. But if I compare the number of offers from empirical systems with the real moves we count in Berlin by statistical demographic data, then only 40% of all moves are covered up in the data of the platform analyzers.
No, this is not exactly true, because we also, so I mean, for robustness checks, we also include all the data they have, but we use here only the data for all the characteristics we want to have. So if people, for instance, do not post, I don't know, the location or whatever, we do robustness checks whether they're